Honorables sénatrices et sénateurs,
Honorable Senators,
today on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, to speak to you about a proposed law which would impact Mi'kma'ki, the unceded lands of the Mi'kmaq people, and, in fact, all the lands and peoples across Canada and North America. I rise to speak at second reading to Senator Quinn's Bill S-273, an act to declare the Chignecto Isthmus Dykeland system and related works to be to the general advantage of Canada. We've heard excellent speeches on this bill from two New Brunswick senators. The bill's sponsor, Senator Quinn, et son frère acadien, Sénateur Cormier.
and the Acadian brother, Senator Cormier.
To hear from someone from the other side of the Chignecto Isthmus. Colleagues, Nova Scotia CTV News special correspondent Steve Murphy sets up the discussion of this critical topic in a very unique and compelling way. He said, and I quote, "National unity has been a recurring issue during Canada's 156 years as a nation. Finding ways to keep the country together through political accommodation has been a challenge for governments for generations. But in 2023, Canada is facing a unity challenge of the sort we have never really seen before. While we have long heard rhetoric about Canada falling apart in the figurative sense, we are today confronted with the prospect that it might literally happen. Storm surge and rising sea levels are threatening to swamp the Isthmus of Chignecto, the tenuous strip of marshland that connects peninsular Nova Scotia to the mainland of North America." And he concludes by saying, "As the only province connected to the rest of the country by a thin slice of vulnerable land, Nova Scotia is the only province that will ever face this existential threat. That makes this a national interest issue. The national government is morally responsible on behalf of all taxpayers to keep the country united, figuratively and literally." End of quote. We'll come back to this point of who is responsible and who pays. But before that, let's have a look at this thin slice of vulnerable land. Because of its central location, the Chignecto Isthmus has long been an important travel corridor. If any of you have traveled in a vehicle to Nova Scotia, you will have passed through the isthmus. And in fact, you will have been welcomed to Nova Scotia when you get there. Because of its central location and its long history as an important travel corridor, approximately 12,000 years ago, following the retreat of the glaciers that covered the Maritimes, the isthmus was one of two, at that time, land routes to the Nova Scotia Peninsula. The other is now under the waters of the Atlantic Ocean. The marshes of the isthmus have a long history of human occupancy. For at least 5,000 years prior to European contact, Mi'kmaq First Nations would gather here to meet and to hunt waterfowl, moose, bear, and porcupine, and to fish. The name Chignecto derives from the Mi'kmaq word Signic, which translates to mean drainage place, and refers to the Great Marsh area. Only 21 kilometers wide at its very narrowest, the isthmus separates two large bodies of water. Chignecto Bay, a sub-basin of the Bay of Fundy, which has, as we know, the highest tides in the world, and the Northumberland Strait, an arm of the Gulf of St. Lawrence on the Atlantic Ocean. The rivers and creeks of the isthmus provided a transportation route for the Mi'kmaq and later Acadians and British traveling between the Bay of Fundy and the Northumberland Strait. The approximately, at its widest, 24-kilometer area located between Tantramar, New Brunswick, Tantramar today, it's called that. It was a town that was formed earlier this year from the amalgamation of the town of Sackville and the village of Dorchester. So from there to Amherst, Nova Scotia, that area is becoming increasingly vulnerable to the severe effects of climate change. In fact, and I didn't know this till I started my research, it's been 16 years since a UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report highlighted the increasing risk to infrastructure on the Chignecto Isthmus due to its rising sea levels, mentioning it alongside the city of New Orleans. Colleagues, we all know about the Hurricane Katrina devastation that happened to New Orleans in 2005, when the resultant storm surge caused 23 breaches in that city's drainage canal levees, and flood walls. Well, the Chignecto Isthmus is not a highly populated area like the city of New Orleans. But, as we heard from Senator Quinn, it is a vital trade corridor, critical to Canada's economic prosperity, through which runs the CN rail line, the Trans-Canada Highway, telecommunications lines, fiber optic lines that link to the transatlantic cables, and of course, where there is farmland, wind farms, important natural corridors for wildlife, and local communities of people to consider. Senator Cormier reminded us that this isthmus, with its system of Acadian dikes and arboiteaux, that has been protecting it for centuries from the high tides of the Bay of Fundy, holds a special historical and cultural place in the psyche of the region's residents, particularly Indigenous people and Acadians. In his testimony to the Senate Standing Committee on Transport and Communications Study on the impacts of climate change on critical infrastructure, Rob Taylor, the Deputy Minister, Department of Transportation and Infrastructure, Government of New Brunswick, said, and I quote him, "Climate change impacts, specifically storm surges and increasing sea levels, pose a risk to infrastructure within the isthmus. Potentially 38 kilometers of dikes, 19 kilometers of Trans-Canada Highway, and 19 kilometers of CNR line will be severely impacted by flooding due to a climatic event in the near future." End of quote. He then went on to cite relevant regional data on already documented rise in sea level, including a 27-centimeter rise in St. John, New Brunswick since 1961, a 21-centimeter rise in Yarmouth, Nova Scotia since 1966, and a 19-centimeter rise in Halifax since 1961. Atlantic Canada is expecting a 1-meter increase in sea level by 2100 and 2 meters or more by 2150. This is serious. He concluded his testimony by saying, and again I quote him, "We wish to acknowledge, as per previous witnesses and climate science experts, that is not whether the Chignecto Isthmus infrastructure will be impacted, but when it will happen. We need to address this risk now, especially since an engineered solution will require up to 10 years to complete." Colleagues, so where are we now, and what are the next steps with this national unity matter? Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and the federal government commissioned a study which resulted in 2022 an engineering and feasibility report, which focused largely on engineering solutions to protect the transportation corridor. In a recent CBC Radio Noon show on the topic of the Chignecto Isthmus, where our colleague had called in, Dr. Danica van Prostisch of St. Mary's University expressed concern that the report, the engineering report, doesn't consider sustainability, protection of the marshlands, or archaeological factors. She cited the example of the dike system on the border of the Netherlands and Belgium, where they've realigned the infrastructure, increased the safety and security of the agricultural lands, and restored large amounts of tidal wetlands, with nature-based solutions an important part of the response to building climate resiliency. After a meeting in Mill River PEI in June of this year, the 4 Atlantic premiers issued the following statement, and I quote them. "The Chignecto Isthmus between New Brunswick and Nova Scotia is a vital corridor at risk due to rising sea levels. The premiers reiterated that the federal government has a constitutional responsibility to maintain links between provinces and fully fund this project." On that same weekend, that the premiers were meeting in PEI, David Cogan, Mayor of Amherst, Nova Scotia, hosted an Atlantic Mayors Caucus. The mayors released their own statement calling for immediate action on the Chignecto Isthmus. Their statement said, "The group is urging the province of Nova Scotia, the province of New Brunswick, and the government of Canada to immediately establish a steering committee to lead the work required to prepare for upgrade or replacement of the Chignecto Isthmus protective infrastructure." They also stated that the Isthmus Steering Committee must include municipal leaders from all 4 Atlantic provinces. Honourable colleagues, Senator Quinn's Senate Public Bill S-273 would invoke Section 92(10) of the Constitution, which allows the federal government to take jurisdiction of undertakings that are of the national interest. He reminds us that this was done when the federal government paid for the new Champlain Bridge in Montreal, as well as a new international bridge to the United States in Windsor. We know that under very severe use-it-or-lose-it pressure from Federal Minister LeBlanc, that Nova Scotia and New Brunswick reluctantly submitted an application to the Federal Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund on a cost-sharing basis, which is the part that they didn't agree to, for the Chignecto Isthmus. While at the same time as they did that, asking Nova Scotia's appeal court to rule on whether Ottawa has, in fact, an exclusive responsibility to maintain the dikes and other structures. Estimates, colleagues, of the total costs range from $400 to $650 million. New Brunswick Premier Higgs sent a letter to Minister LeBlanc citing sections 91(29) and 92(10) of the Constitution, underlining the evidence that interprovincial transportation is the sole authority of the federal government. Honourable colleagues, I am not a constitutional expert, as you can probably tell, and while I applaud my colleague Senator Quinn's initiative with sponsoring Bill S-273, I can't honestly say whether this is the best mechanism to induce the action that is required on this matter of national importance. I do, however, most definitely agree that this provocative bill on this critical matter of the Chignecto Isthmus merits very careful study in committee. This September, after post-tropical storm Lee put the risks and storm anxiety back into the nightmares of locals, Mayor Andrew Black of border town Tantramar, New Brunswick, commented, and I quote Mayor Black, "It seems like every big storm that comes our way, our people get more and more anxious. You know, is this going to be the storm that the high tide in the Bay of Fundy will cause the dikes to fail and cut us off from Nova Scotia?" Mayor Black and his counterpart on the other side of the Isthmus, Mayor David Cogan of Amherst, Nova Scotia, are major proponents of the flood protection project. They're focused on making sure that the project is completed as soon as possible and not on the disagreements on who might fund it. Honourable colleagues, getting on with action on building a climate-resilient future for the highly vulnerable Chignecto Isthmus is a matter of urgency for Mayors Cogan and Black and for all the people of their communities and of our neighbouring provinces. Of course it is. And colleagues, in conclusion, I will reiterate what journalist Steve Murphy reminds us of. No matter what province or territory we represent here in this chamber, honourable colleagues, ensuring a strong, protected, and sustainable Chignecto Isthmus is in fact essential to keeping our country, Canada, united, literally. Colleagues, let's get this bill to committee and discuss how we can best keep our country together. Merci, Walaleo. Thank you.